Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Australian Survivor Titans versus Rebels following week 6. And this was kind of a crazy week. A lot of strange stuff happening, both from a game standpoint and also from an edit standpoint. But we'll get to that soon enough. But there are 11 players to talk about, and let's waste some more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 11, we have the first boot from this week. And here we have Eileen, who ends up being the first member of the jury here. And again, I felt like it was pretty clear Eileen was going out here, not only from a game standpoint where her side of things just didn't have the numbers to get their way, but even beyond that, you have her like not getting any confessionals outside of her moment of warning Ferris to be careful for Caroline and Kitty, which leads into them voting against him this round. So again, Eileen going out here isn't too shocking. Now, I will say from a game standpoint, I feel like she played mostly fine. And while we saw a lot of her flaws in the show, like her trying to execute these plans, only for them to backfire, and people talking about not trusting her that much, I do feel like Eileen is a solid player and someone who could definitely do well if she were to ever come back, though I doubt that. But obviously she is now out of the game, which is why she's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, we have the next boot on the board, and here we have Jaden. And Jaden ends up getting taken out here in a pretty strange vote, if you ask me. I feel like the episode doesn't do a great job at explaining why Jaden is the boot here, though obviously there were stuff like vote slipping at Tribal, and again, a lot of crazy stuff happening here. But obviously Jaden is taken out as a pretty expendable number here, and it's kind of funny that he ends up going out against Alex, who was also a bit expendable in the game. But obviously, I mean, Jaden was someone who I never thought had much of a chance. I feel like his edit was mostly subdued, where I feel like most of his content early on was him bench pressing. Even at the point where he was getting some content later on, I feel like it was mostly negative content. And then obviously you have him flipping on Eden after last week's episode, which I do still think is a mistake. I feel like it kind of just made him even more expendable in the game, which obviously plays out in this vote. And I feel like he's someone who didn't really have too many prospects moving forward. I feel like he doesn't really have many close allies that are willing to go to bat for him, or even though it was a relatively close vote in this boot round, I feel like it would have been hard to see how he gets to the end and win. And obviously I feel like that was also reflected within the edit. So again, Jaden isn't a major loss of the season, but I still find his boot episode to be mostly confusing, though he is obviously now out of the game, which is why he's here number 10. Now moving on to number 9, we have the final boot from this week, and here we have Valeria, who I was obviously very high on for a lot of this season, where she was number 1 for the last couple of weeks on these power rankings. Now, I will say that her edit for this week was mostly quiet, which I did find to be a bit of a red flag. I feel like she was starting to dip in my estimation, though obviously she gets content in this latest episode where she wants to shake things up by taking out Rihanna, which did feel a bit misguided considering that Rihanna wasn't really much of a threat in the game aside from weakening Kirby and also taking out someone who was better in challenges. Though all this leads up into the actual vote where she is taken out in a really bizarre way where obviously Raymond's advantage comes into play, where due to them all voting for Raymond, due to Raymond like putting on this show of making him seem like he was giving up, Raymond got to cast a sole vote to evict, and obviously he chooses to send her out, which obviously this twist is kind of insane due to the amount of power it gives someone, though I am willing to excuse it to a degree considering how situational it is. The fact that it only works when everyone votes for you, and how obviously while it does give one person a lot of power, it also only takes one person to completely counter it and screw you over. So again, I am kind of like up in the air about the twist itself, but obviously it does lead to Valeria being taken out here. Now, even though I had Valeria pretty high on my power rankings for a lot of it, I don't think she was playing the best game in the world during the last couple of weeks, where obviously she like did stuff like upset Caroline to that whole situation. She obviously was out of the loop in some situations, and while I wouldn't have her that low on my player ranking, I do feel like from a pure game standpoint, there are definitely some things to be desired here. But obviously she is now out of the game, so she is here at number 9. And with that, there are 8 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But at number 8, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is still Kitty. Now obviously Kitty has been getting more content simply by the fact that there aren't that many people left, Though at the same time, I feel like she doesn't really do a good job at explaining what she's doing during a lot of the week, where during the Jaden round, like it's pretty unclear like why she actually flips to vote with Kirby, considering that she had been working with Caroline for a lot of the game. And yeah, while you can kind of glean that it's due to Caroline being this emotional player, I feel like the show like doesn't really hammer that in to a great degree. And while I'm not saying that there's no reason why she flipped here, where she probably does have a rationale from a strategic standpoint, I'm more so emphasizing the fact that the show doesn't make it clear what's happening. And obviously backfires as well, where she fails to take out Alex during that round, and then she has to do some damage control. So again, I feel like the way that the show is presenting her is like pretty bad in my eyes, where it's not really clear what she's doing, and even at the points where she is getting content, like it's not really being that effective within the game, which is why I do have her here number 8. Now moving on to number 7, we have another person that I just don't feel that great about at this point, and here we have Rihanna. Now I will say that Kitty's probably playing a better game than Rihanna, but I do feel like Rihanna is on the show a bit more, and she does seem a bit more relevant to the actual story, where obviously she is aligned with Kirby, although at the same time, that's not really saying much considering that it doesn't seem like Kirby takes her that seriously. Though me on that, like I feel like most of her content is not particularly great, where during the most recent episode, she was so worried that Raymond was going to flip on her, and obviously like she's kind of showing a negative light there. And really, I feel like she's someone that's not taking that seriously in the game. It's hard for me to see how she wins the game at this point, considering her game position, where obviously she was the only person to vote for Valeria during the Jaden round, completely left out of the vote there again. So again, I'm not saying that Rihanna's playing a particularly great game, but again, I feel like she's on the show a little bit more than Kitty, which is why she's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, we have another person kind of in a similar ballpark to Rihanna, and here we have Alex. And Alex has also been shown pretty negatively on the show, where you have him during the reward in the latest episode, where he talks about wanting to work with Valeria, Ferris, and Kitty, only for Ferris to say that it's not going to work. You also have him in episode 16, where he does allude to him having an idol that obviously leads into him playing it, though obviously he almost gets voted out despite that, where he plays his idol on Valeria. He ends up being the minority target there, so he could have accidentally sent himself out of the game when he was in a spot where he could have saved himself. That's pretty bad. Again, I feel like from a game standpoint, he's probably playing the worst game out of the people still left, where he's just been consistently out of the loop for a lot of the season. Again, in the minority during the Eileen round. During the Jaden round, he's one vote away from being sent out himself, despite him playing an idol, which is pretty bad. And then during the Valeria round, he loses someone who we actively talked about having a relationship with in the latest episode. So again, I feel like it's looking pretty bad from Alex, both from a game standpoint, but also from an edit standpoint, which is why he's here number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this person continues to slide in my estimation, even though they are technically moving up one spot from last week, and here we have Caroline. And this was a mostly bad week for Caroline, where it really leans into her being seen as this emotional player, where obviously she gets very emotional after failing to target Ferris during last week's episode. You obviously have people like Kitty like turning on her for no reason, because Caroline seems like this emotional and unstable player, at least based on what the show is showing us. And then beyond that, while she is voting correctly during the Eileen round and the Jaden round, I feel like the show like kind of has left her off to dry at this point. She comes off as paranoid. Like there's just not that much there to say is positive for her edit, which is why she's here number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this person has moved up from last week, though I still don't think they're winning per se, and here we have Raymond. And obviously this was a pretty big week for Raymond, largely because it had to, considering the amount of focus he had on his advantage that got through the auction, and that it was only valid to play through this week. And obviously he does end up playing it in a pretty big move, where he ends up pretending that he gave up and then asking to be voted out just so that he could play the advantage there, which obviously is a pretty risky move and one that could have easily backfired, though it obviously pays off there, with Ferris being more than happy to go along with it, is able to take out Valeria, who obviously has been a pretty big player up to this point. And he has been getting a little bit of content talking about how like he's ready to step things up, that he's thinking more about his resume on Survivor. So again, there are some minor things that are positive about Raymond's edit from this week, though at the same time, I still feel like it's just leading up to him being a losing finalist by the end, where I feel like that's been my prediction for where he's going to land for a lot of the season. And I feel like that's where it's going at this point, where even though he got a lot of content this week, it's unclear whether that's going to build up to anything or if that's just going to be a one-off thing for him. So again, we'll have to see what happens there. But I do still acknowledge that this was a better week for him compared to a lot of other people, which is why he's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and I feel like this should be the pretty clear top 3 at this point, and it's really just a matter of ordering them. But number 3, I did decide to go with Kirby. Now I think out of these top 3, Kirby has definitely been the more dominant presence obviously on the season, where she has managed to remain in control for a lot of the game, which I do find mostly impressive here. Though at the same time, I still find a lot of her decisions here to be pretty questionable, where she does decide to take out Eileen in a spot where she wants to weaken the Ferris group, and I feel like that should have backfired on her more, though it actually doesn't, and we don't really hear much from Ferris after this, which I do think is a pro for her, at least in the short term. And then you have her allowing the Ferris group to go along with taking out Valeria, which obviously like makes them feel more comfortable with her, where again, I did kind of question whether it was a good move for her to allow the Ferris group to take out Valeria there, as obviously she was still working with a lot of the Titans there. I did come around to it being a passable enough move, considering that, again, like she could at least have deniability, and considering she was one of the few people that knew about Raymond's advantage to begin with, obviously it would have made it very hard for her to escape blame if she allowed Raymond to go home there. I do think on the whole, she has been playing the most dominant game of this top 3, but I still have the sense that she's probably going to lose the battle against Ferris by the end of it. Or even though she has been outplaying Ferris for a lot of the game, we've been getting content like in the next time on that Ferris will start to get his revenge on Kirby now as they're getting towards the end game. And it makes sense too, considering just how big of a threat Kirby should be at this point in the game. Though obviously we'll have to see what happens there. I still think she's been obviously a pretty big character in the show, but I feel like she's someone who's going to come up short by the end of it, which is why I do have her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, we have the other pretty massive character on the season, and here we have Ferris. And obviously this was another pretty big week for Ferris, particularly in that last episode where he ended up taking a lot of the credit for Raymond's move, where obviously he said they should have won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. Though obviously he does lose Eileen, which is obviously not great. And you also have him being on the outs during the Jaden round, which isn't particularly great. And again, that vote is kind of a weird one where Raymond flipped at the last moment. That obviously made things difficult. But still, like, he is technically on the outs there. And then obviously he does rebound in this latest episode. I still get the sense that he is going to win the battle against Kirby, which is obviously a big reason why I have him over Kirby. It's just a question of whether one of these two are going to actually win by the end of it. Where regardless of which one wins the war, are they going to allow a big character like this to actually come out on top and win the season? I think that's still a pretty big question mark, but I still give some credence to that idea, which is a big reason I do have him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Australian Survivor Titans vs. Rebels at this point is Mark. And I kind of went back and forth on this. I wasn't entirely sure what to do with this top spot here. As, again, I feel like there's definitely an argument for Kirby or Ferris being number 1, as obviously they're pretty massive characters on the season, and obviously they've been driving a lot of the action during the season, while Mark has kind of taken a back seat to a degree. Not as big as Valeria, obviously, but he still is someone that hasn't quite gone his way at all points. Where obviously he did have some reservations about working with Kirby earlier in the week, and then obviously in this latest episode he ends up losing Valeria, who was his closest ally. Again, big knock to him game-wise, though at the same time I still think there is some room for him to rebound. Where I would say out of these like top 3 contenders, he is technically the one who's been playing the worst game up to this point, but I still feel like he has some room to recover, where again, like with how big of a characters that Ferris and Kirby are, it's very likely that one of them wins the battle, but then towards the end, the other one becomes such a massive threat that they end up being taken out there. And I do think Mark is still in a spot to where he could like be the one to take out that final person, get to the end against someone like an Alex or a Raymond and win that way, or possibly even a Caroline, for instance. I do think Mark has some winning scenarios. It's just a matter of like how he gets there. And I think he is probably like the least obvious out of these top 3, which does make me think he could come up at the end of it, though I think this next week will be pretty pivotal to that end. So again, I am kind of in flux with these actual rankings, but for now, I will leave Mark here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps with the channel. And I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm covering Survivor 46, as well as The Traitors, which is about to end, but you can expect the power rankings of those shows, along with new shows such as Big Brother Canada and The Amazing Race 36 that are right around the corner. I am also on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting that channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.